The shuttle door opened to a wall of white that moved like smoke, a slow ghost of driven crystals that scratched face shields and hissed against fabric seams as if the cold itself had teeth. Calyx stretched away in a flat, blinding plain scored by old wind, a world of powder and polished facets where the horizon felt closer than it looked because the air carried almost no haze. The first breath inside the helmet tasted thin and pure, and the second breath tasted like worry. The loudspeaker in the hull boomed in 3 different lingua, then switched to standard for emphasis. Survival Trial, Section 12. Mixed Species Teams. Duration, 24 hours. Single rule, no fire allowed. The sentence rang with the finality of a door latch. Mara Gray watched the words flicker across her wrist display and locked the phrase in her mind, not because she planned to break it, but because she planned to understand it. She had learned long ago that rules on hostile worlds were written for a reason, and sometimes the reason did not match the phrasing. She stepped down with the first squad, her boot pinions biting through crust into older snow, and checked that her Draley teammate's hood seal sat properly around the gill slit that had been adapted for thin, dry air. The Draley, whose name was Hesh, blinked horizontally and raised his hand in the Academy's clipped salute. His fingers were long and webbed, elegant in a way that made tool grips look like an insult. He pretended confidence, but the fine tremor in his wrists told a more honest story. A second loudspeaker, this time the examiner's drone, skimmed overhead like a dark, silent gull and projected a schematic of the trial zone into the snow around them. Landmarks surfaced as cold blue lines. A ridge to the west, an ice-scoured basin to the north, a peppering of methane pockets eastward that flashed with warning sigils. No open combustion, came the examiner's voice, clear and cool. No powered heaters, no igniters, no stored fuels, no reactive chemicals intended for thermal release. Equipment audit begins in 5 minutes. Begin. The drone blinked red once and rose into the pale sky. Mara angled her visor to kill glare and led the squad toward a ripple in the terrain where wind had scooped a shallow swale. She had no interest in the theater of leadership. She had an interest in the windrows, the drift patterns, and the fact that the sky star was high enough to throw hard light through anything clear. She kept her breathing measured, counting heartbeats the way an exhale steadies a rifle. She knew the difference between cold that made a person uncomfortable and cold that rewired judgment. Hesh followed in her footprints at first, then beside them when he realized mirrored steps would tramp a trench that wicked heat out of both bodies. He did not talk. He saved his breath to feed muscles and conserve moisture in his lungs. A Methal-born Vorthak cadet from another team clanked past on wide splay feet, his suit outgassing faint curls that crystallized and fell as glitter. He waved with an easy, forward tilt of shoulders that said his species worshipped winter, then stomped away toward the caution sigils as if the hazard markers were decorative. Mara marked his confidence, marked the methane pockets, and filed both as problems for later. She knelt where the swale dipped, plunged her glove into the top layer, and felt the snow grade change at elbow depth from airy powder to denser crumb. She scraped a cross-section down to the density change, then dug a hollow against the lee face with a short shovel, working with the rhythm that keeps a person from sweating. Sweat inside a suit is betrayal. Hesh crouched opposite her and carved his side with a wedge of composite, his movements methodical and a little too careful. His breath fogged his visor in brief bursts that cleared when he swallowed, and the shape of his jaw said the swallow took effort. "We need a roof," she said. He nodded and cut blocks from the denser layer, passing them one by one. She set the first course in a horseshoe, then stepped inside and lifted each additional block so the arch would load against itself, rather than rely on a miracle. Snow is a faithless friend unless a person understands the truce that weight and angle can make with gravity. By the time the entrance faced leeward and the roof settled into a low dome, the interior air had quieted from hiss to hush. The hush made the sound of Hesh's breathing larger than it should have been. She checked his hand once as he passed a block and felt the tremor again, more pronounced now. She did not name it aloud. Naming a problem too early can turn it proud. Instead, she cinched the vent sleeve at the crown, packed the joints, and let the faint warmth of two bodies begin its slow work. The examiner drone drifted to the entrance and blinked green when her scanner read the structure as stable. "Shelter registered, Squad 4, came the voice. "Audit commences." Inside the dome, the audit felt like a magistrate's visit. The drone extended a sampling wand and tasted the air, tasted the composite of their clothing, tasted the patch kit in Mara's belt pouch. The wand paused at a brown wrapper ration bar. "Permitted," the voice said. The wand hovered over a signal flare in Hesh's gear and glowed orange. "Disallowed." Remove Hesh's mouth tightened, but he set the flare outside. The wand dipped into the weave of his scarf, reading the insulative gel inside. "Permitted if unheated." The drone withdrew and made a churring sound that might have been a recording of approval. "Remember, no fire allowed. Violations terminate the trial." The wind pressed a shadow against the dome and then passed. The silence stretched. Mara unrolled a thermal map on her knee and surveyed the zone while the fine frost that always tracks a person inside a snow shelter settled into the wall like a second skin. Outside, the Academy's other squads cut sawtooth blocks and inflated tents built to handle low pressure and cold. But the tents looked a little too proud for a wind like this, too tall for the way gusts carve vortices that snatch seams. She knew these worlds collect pride the way a low place collects snow. A person should never give a storm a handhold. Hesh sipped from a narrow tube and shuddered when the water hit his tongue. He made the involuntary hum the Draley make when cold fingers push into the spaces behind their gills. She shifted closer, not quite touching, and asked him to talk through his body checklist because voice uses heat, and heat from voice is better spent on mind than panic. He told her his toes felt wooden and his fingertips felt like pebbles. He said his jaw had begun to twitch. He said his heartbeat felt fast and weak, which is a way of saying the pump had to work too hard to move syrup. She watched his throat work and measured the cadence of his breathing against the quiet pulse she could feel through the wall. He needed real warmth, not a placebo. She had gel packs that would exotherm on activation, but the rule named reactive chemicals intended for thermal release, and she was not interested in rolling dice with a drone that could watch his equipment telemetry through the shelter wall. She set the gel packs aside and looked at the dome's interior with the eyes of someone who had learned to count in second purposes. Snow was a wall, and also a filter, and also a memory, and light was heat wearing a mask. Her display clock ticked away the false comfort of minutes that look small until a body is losing the argument with cold. Outside the dome, the wind shifted, and light fell through the vent and struck the wall near her left shoulder. The patch where it struck did not simply brighten, it thickened, a luminous spot nesting inside the blue like a coin inside felt. She turned her head slightly until the bright spot sharpened, and then she cut a narrow slot in the inner wall at face height and looked through it. The air outside glittered with suspended frost, and pieces of the sky broke into hard plains of white and pale blue where distant ice sheets lay bare. She closed the slot and rubbed the patch where light had pooled with her glove until the inner face went glassy. The patch threw a bead of sharper brightness onto the floor. It was nothing yet. It was a story beginning that did not know its plot. She did not touch it again. Hesh's breath came ragged once, then steadied when he focused on her voice. She asked him to tell her a story about home. He described a brackish estuary with long bronze reeds that wrote music when wind moved through them. He said a person could read the current by the shape of the reed song. He smiled once when he remembered a summer swarm of younglings that had rushed a tide pool and shouted when a sand eel shot out like a thrown knife. He laughed at the memory and then coughed because the laugh startled his chest. The drone returned for a second pass and clicked softly. a sound that had been calibrated to feel like company without interrupting thinking. 2 hours logged, the voice said. Wind increasing. Temperature drop forecast of 6 degrees by mid-cycle. Outside, a Vorthak instructor in a graphite cloak stood at parade still and watched the teams through a visor that made him look carved rather than clothed. His name was Commander Sirek, and the rumor said he could recite casualty numbers from a campaign 3 winters old without shifting tone. He turned his head toward the methane flats and then toward the ridge and then toward the place where the sky was brightest. He did not move again. On the intercom band, Examiner Luma spoke in a voice like cracked ice smoothed with warm hands. She explained the rationale for the rule without apology. Methane pockets outgassed when pressure dropped, and a careless flame could turn a basin into a crater. Spark and smolder can migrate under crust. On Calyx, combustion was a betrayal that spread. The rule was not a dare, it was a wall. Mara listened to the words and watched the light bead on the floor inch toward Hesh's boot with the slow patience of winter. She scooped the bead with a gloved finger and lost it to the glove's dull weave. She did not curse. She rubbed the wall again and let light condense a second time, noting the angle, the hour, the way the wall's polish mattered. Hesh's tremor moved up his forearms. His body did not hoard heat well because heat leaves water faster than it leaves fat, and his biology had been written for warm estuaries, not air the temperature of a knife's persuasion. She shared a ration with him and told him to chew slowly because chewing is heat disguised as habit. The bar tasted like disappointed cocoa and salt. Outside, the tents rattled with a sound like an argument. A squad on the ridge shouted when a gust pivoted a shelter and buckled a strut. The shout traveled strangely in thin air, arriving in the ear like a letter that had been opened by someone else first. Mara felt the old memory of a mountain bivouac on Earth slide under the present like a second skin. That bivouac had taught her 3 clean lessons. Roofs should curve, entrances should bow toward silence, and rules should be read aloud exactly as written while a person looks at the world the rules were written for. She repeated the single rule in her mind the way a person tastes a word first in the mouth's front and then at the back. No fire allowed, no powered heaters, no manufactured ignition sources, no open flames in the open air. She rolled the words like stones, finding edges by feel. She did not feel clever. She felt responsible. Hesh's breath fogged the visor again and cleared again. She tightened the vent sleeve a finger width, just enough to hold more warmth without starving the dome of fresh air. She checked the wall for the faintest soot smell out of superstition and found only the clean, slightly metallic scent of crushed snow. The beat of light returned when the sun slid a degree on its cold arc. She did not chase it this time. She let it sit and pale, then die, and told herself that dying light can be useful if it dies in a predictable way. The clock on her wrist ticked into the next block of the trial. The dome walls thickened by a fractional shade as frost and breath fused, and the noise of the wind softened as if the storm had grown tired of hearing itself. She spoke Hesh's name once and told him calmly what would follow. First the teeth chatter, then the clumsy hands, then the hurt that dulls into a lie that says sleep would be a bargain. She told him that she would not grant him that bargain. He nodded and said her name in the Draley way, letting the last vowel slide like a low tide through pebbles. He said he trusted her judgment. His voice was thin but unbroken. She checked the ridge line through the entrance slit and measured shadows like a carpenter measures a beam. She outlined a plan in her head and did not write it on the mission board because the board did not need to know it yet. The plan did not break the rule. It asked the rule a question. She cleared a patch of floor and brushed crystals into a shallow plate with the side of her glove, compressing the surface until it took a shine. The plate would be useless for now and useful later. She pressed her palm against it and felt the slightest reflection of her body's insistence. She looked at Hesh, at the thin knit of his scarf, at the way his pupils had narrowed until the color around them seemed larger. She could measure his body's decline in small, honest units, the time between shivers, the thickness of syllables, the pauses between swallow and breath. She did not hurry her voice when she told him another story from Earth about a winter lake and a sheet of ice that had sung when wind stroked it, a voice like a bowed saw that rose in the night until everyone in the cabin sat up in their blankets and listened. She told him the song had not meant danger. It had meant flex and patience, the lake's way of reminding the shore that it was alive under a hard skin. Hesh smiled again, small and real. The drone made another pass. 4 hours logged, the examiner said. Shelter integrity sound. Squad 4 vitals. 1 trending low. Mara raised her wrist so the drone could see her acknowledgement. She did not ask for a waiver. A waiver would come with a cost that would stain a record she could not afford to stain. She leaned back against the dome, closed her eyes for 5 measured breaths, and let every useless thought fall into the snow where no one could trip on it. When she opened her eyes, the light had shifted to a new angle. She ran a fingertip over the polished patch again and watched the bright bead form with a steadier core. The bead sat on the plate she had cleared and held its shape long enough to imagine it as a seed. She had no flame, no heater, no excused rule. She had geometry, patience, and a partner whose life would ask her to read the difference between intent and letter. She felt the cold press at her fingertips and then pull away as the dome's tiny climate swung back toward livable. The day on Calyx went on, the wind wrote its long sentences across the plain, and the rule sat in the air like a sign at a crossroads. She did not touch it. She memorized it. She promised herself she would not break it and would not let it break him. She kept her promise in a way that did not feel heroic at all, just steady and exact, like counting steps across a frozen river without looking down. The dome's hush held the small sounds that mattered. Hesh's breath easing when she spoke, the knit of snow settling into its own weight, the soft tick of wind polishing the outer skin. She raised her wrist display and pulled up the directive until the words stood alone in the visor, black on white with no margin for interpretation, except the one that honest survival sometimes demands. No fire allowed, no powered heaters, no manufactured ignition sources, no open flames in the open air. The phrasing carried a history of accidents in every syllable, but it also named borders instead of painting the whole landscape in red. She read it aloud in a voice pitched to calm a pulse, and Hesh repeated the last line in his careful accent, as if the sentence were a knot that would hold better if 4 hands pulled it tight. He needed heat that could not be accused of recklessness, and she needed to find it without bargaining with pity or pride. She closed the directive and opened the field manual fragment that listed Calyx's hazards. Methane seep points clustered in low basins and fracture zones. Ignition potential varied with pressure shifts, and stray sparks could run under crust along gas veins like a fuse under glass. The manual also reminded cadets that snow is air with patience, that a dome is a respirator if vents are cut properly, and that light is heat under a different name if a person knows how to speak that name. She smiled without humor when she saw the diagram of a parabolic sun stove on a temperate world with bright grass and a careless margin note about summer picnics. Calyx would punish a mind that chased that comfort. She needed containment that could be proven safe to an examiner who would not care about intentions, only outcomes. She leaned a shoulder into the curved wall and tested the stiffness of the inner skin with a gloved thumb. The ice grains near the polished patch had fused into a thin pane under breath and pressure. If she could make a lens from that clarity, she could change the air in a tiny chamber by degrees that mattered. An open flame in the open air was forbidden. A contained combustion inside an engineered snow chamber with scrubbed exhaust was not described by the words on her wrist. She could hear Commander Sirek's dry voice in memory. Read the sentence, then read the ground. If the two disagree, adjust the ground without lying to the sentence. She considered the ethics even as she mapped the steps. She would announce the design to the drone before ignition, and she would demonstrate scrubbed exhaust. If the examiner demanded a halt, she would halt. If the examiner accepted the letter, she would accept the responsibility for the spirit. Hesh watched her face with the serious patience of someone who had learned to trust a single, steady thing in a bad season. He rubbed his hands together in slow circles and admitted that his fingertips had become strangers. She told him the plan in whole, not in fragments, because consent from a partner must be earned with the same clarity that design demands. He agreed without dramatics and asked one question that mattered. What proof would persuade an examiner that the chamber was safe before the first ember glowed? She liked that question. She liked the way it bent toward shared safety rather than toward loopholes. She answered with airflow and chemistry in plain words. Cold air sinks, warm air rises, vents pull, filters trap. A snow chimney with a narrow throat and a sintered cap would condense moisture and catch soot, and a stone base would keep hot from touching volatile crust. She would polish a small lens from clear ice and focus light on tinder until it smoldered inside a sealed cavity. The flame would not meet open air. Exhaust would pass through packed snow that behaved like a winter lung. She sketched it in the frost with a gloved finger, a cup scooped into the floor, a stone at the bottom, an ice bell over the cup, a finger-width intake channel at the base, a pencil-thin chimney rising into a packed filter, and a reflector to keep radiant heat aimed inward. The reflector would be the only manufactured aid aside from the lens and the dome itself, and even that would be repurposed trash rather than a device made to ignite. A ration wrapper blessed with a thin aluminum layer would suffice. The question of tinder remained. She inventoried gear again without touching the gel packs that could disqualify the attempt. The med kit held gauze and paper labels that could be shredded into fluff. The rations included fibrous plant protein that crumbled into a dry lint if needed under a glove. Her scarf had a frayed edge that could donate a curl if necessity asked politely. Nothing smelled of solvent or fuel. Nothing would violate the clause about reactive chemicals intended for thermal release. She made a second list in her head. The list of enemies that would not show up on the wrist. Sweat, haste, pride, and the seductive comfort of an argument that calls a risk small because a friend is in pain. She set her jaw against the urge to rush and check the external world again through the entrance slit. The wind had shifted, so the methane flats to the east streamed a hair-thin vapor that lay along the surface like silk. She picked a new compass line inside the dome that pointed away from that silk and whispered the line to Hesh so he could hold it in his own mind. A person who knows where the danger sits walks differently. Examiner Luma's voice arrived with a low chime and a reminder about venting practices. The academy had seen students choke a dome with zeal when cold began to press. The fix for that zeal was discipline, not more rules. Mara eased the crown vent another finger width and watched frost plume out in a faint, disciplined ghost that died a handspan above the dome. She explained to Hesh that a proper vent is a promise, not a sign. Snow handles promises well. Snow never forgives lies. She set her timer to the star's arc, counting minutes until the sun reached an angle that would put the bright bead exactly where the cup would sit. She needed the first ignition to be clean, not a frantic chase across the floor. In the waiting, she shaped the argument she would offer the drone. She would not hide intention. She would say the words the rule used and then point to the features that made the design legal under that phrasing. She would ask the drone to record the geometry and the airflow before ignition and to monitor the exhaust during operation. She would invite a shutdown at the first sign of soot at the crown vent. She would accept that shutdown with grace and call for medical extraction for Hesh if the examiner refused the containment. The plan felt like a bridge made of joined planks, each one tested with a heel before the next. She felt the old relief that comes when a mind has more structure than a storm. Hesh watched the polished patch with the focused hope of someone watching a far shoreline through rain. He asked for the steps again, not because memory faltered, but because mind and breath steady when a sequence is recited. She described the chamber, the lens, the reflector, the tinder, the intake, the chimney, the filter, the demonstration. He nodded and asked to practice the explanation so he could repeat it if her voice failed. She did not plan to let her voice fail. She admired the instinct. Outside, a pair of cadets in reflective cloaks trudged past the dome, heads down, pulling a sled that squealed on hard crust. The sound made Hesh flinch. She held up 2 fingers and lowered them in a slow count that told his nervous system to trust a new rhythm rather than the squeal. He matched her breath without trying to impress her. The drone made a lazy circuit and paused at the entrance. "Status request," the examiner said. "Squad 4 acknowledges." She reported Hesh's trending numbers in short phrases and added the plan title without describing the mechanics: sealed heat chamber for medical stabilization, no open flame, no manufactured ignition, exhaust scrubbing in place. The drone clicked for 2 heartbeats. Demonstrate containment and venting prior to ignition. Show intake geometry. Show filter. Obey halt if issued. She thanked the examiner for the clear instructions and signed the audio with her identifier. Hesh exhaled a sound that might have been gratitude when the permissions settled into the room like a new kind of warmth. He flexed his fingers until the pebbles in his hands became knuckles again. She ran through risks a final time and pared them down to what skill and humility could handle. The plan left no room for improvisation once the lens focused. She would not let an ember seek a path she had not already mapped. She tamped a ring in the floor with the heel of her glove to remind her hand where the bell would sit, then brushed a thin trench toward the wall where the intake would draw. She pressed her palm over the trench and felt the faint kiss of cold air slipping past her wrist. Good. Air wanted to move if a person gave it a reason. She cupped her hands and blew gently toward the crown vent. The draft answered with a whisper that told her the chimney would pull if she built it true. She angled her visor just enough to catch the bright spot forming again, and narrowed her eyes until the world outside vanished and only the bead remained. She counted heartbeats as the bead sharpened on the glossy plate, then watched it fade and shift as the sun continued its slow migration. She looked away before frustration could masquerade as faith. The numbers on her wrist told her when the star would return to the angle she wanted. Time until lens, 43 minutes. Time until Hesh lost the argument with his own blood, a number she refused to name. She used the minutes to adjust the interior narrative of what she was about to do. This was not a trick, not a rebellion, not a way to win points at a board. This was a medical intervention under supervision, executed within the letter of a rule written by people who had survived hard lessons. She imagined the debrief room, the long table, the counselors with sealed expressions. She imagined explaining why a mind that reads is not a mind that cheats. She imagined Commander Sirek's nod, small and nearly invisible, the kind that meant a lesson had been absorbed without theater. The star crept back to the edge of the vent. Light softened in the dome, then hardened, then gathered itself into the first clean bead she trusted. She slid a gloved finger to the floor and touched the plate where the bead wanted to live, measuring distance and focus without breaking the promise to avoid haste. She told Hesh it was time to build the chamber, and he answered in a voice that steadied her more than she expected. She did not reach for the ice yet. She reached for the argument again and repeated it one last time until the words sat inside her chest with the same weight as the lens that would soon sit inside her hands. No fire allowed meant do not feed flames to open air. No powered heaters meant do not cheat with a device. No manufactured ignition sources meant do not spark with a tool. No open flames in the open air meant build walls around what must burn to save a life, prove the walls work, and then accept the responsibility for the heat that follows. She looked at Hesh and let him see that her mind was clear. He looked back and let her see that his trust was not blind. The plan had become a path that belonged to both of them, and the dome had become a room where law and mercy could sit together without lying to each other. She set the work in motion without fanfare, because the difference between a plan and a rescue is the first exact cut. The star edged higher, a pale coin behind thin cloud, and the vent glow on the dome's inner skin told her how much time she owned before the clean bead returned. She chose the clearest patch inside the wall just off the entrance slit, where breath and hand pressure had already fused grains into a thin pane. She pressed her glove against it and felt that particular resistance that meant the snow had turned to ice with enough clarity to bend light instead of swallowing it. A lens must be carved from trust, not from wish. She scored a rectangle with the short field knife, easing the blade until the line sang with that dry, glassy tone that ice gives when the cut is true. The block came away with a modest pop. She held it up and turned it until the star's brightness rummaged through the cloud and found a path through the ice. The beam smeared at first, a dull wash, so she laid the block on the glossy plate on the floor and began to shape it. The tool for this kind of work is patience wearing a different glove. She used the knife to knock corners down into a rough oval, then swapped to the soft, destructive kindness of snow itself, rubbing the block on a shallow bed of fine crystals until edges blurred and planes became curves. She made a biconvex form by feel, using her breath to fog the surface and reveal high spots. When her lungs protested the waste of warmth, she let Hesh lean close and fog a pass for her. His breath was shallow but steady. He watched the way the frost traced the lens's errors and smiled faintly when the oval took on the first ghost of symmetry. She reached into a pocket and pinched out a few grains of salt from the ration kit, stirred those grains into a thimble of meltwater she had warmed against her palm, and made a brine that turned snow into a finer abrasive. She dabbed the lens, rubbed again on the snow bed, dabbed again, buffed with the inside of her wool cap along a quadrant until the ice shone like glass. She rotated seam and stroke the way a carpenter rotates sandpaper to honor the grain. The lens woke under her hands. A soft polish replaced frost. The convex faces began to hold reflections instead of just throwing them away. She checked thickness by pinching edges and center, guessing focal length by memory and rough lens maker arithmetic that had once been a game in a mountain cabin. If ice bends light with an index a little above water, then a curve with a palm's radius will give a focus about a palm and a half away. She did not need numbers. She needed a bead to become a needle. She set the oval against the bright patch on the wall, lifted it until the smear of light on the floor tightened, and moved her wrist a finger width at a time until the smear shrank into a coin and then into a coin's cut edge. A faint warmth kissed the plate, not enough to help a life yet, enough to confirm the geometry. She kept polishing because enough is a trap that likes to pretend it is mercy. Hesh did the tasks his hands could own without cost. He rubbed the inside of the dome with slow circles to fuse more pain-ready patches in case the lens fractured. He teased a strip of aluminum from a ration wrapper with careful nails so the foil stayed uncrumpled. He tore gauze into the softest possible lint, rotating the fibers in his palms until the mass opened like a dry cloud. Each small success put a little color back into his voice, and each tremor that returned reminded her that time had not turned friendly. When the lens could throw a bead that melted a pinhole in the plate in 30 silent counts, she called that face good and devoted 10 more minutes to the other side so the beam would not suffer from a skewed curve. She did not chase perfection past usefulness. She stopped when the bead sharpened faster than her breath fogged the pain. The chamber would waste less if the lens did not fight the light. The next part needed a base that would not melt into the floor the moment heat arrived. She did not want to trust the blade of her shovel for that job because the metal would carry heat into the dome's belly and start a slow, treacherous collapse. Stone would hold heat without traveling too far. The swale outside had been carved by old wind into a scoop, and old wind loves to gather pebbles where flow slackens. She told Hesh to stay inside and work the foil into a shallow dish with his thumbs while she stepped into the mouth of the entrance slit, checked the direction of the surface silk over the methane flats, and moved up the lee of the swale no more than 10 paces. The snow there was thin enough to show the first freckles of moraine on blue ice. She pried up a fist-sized dark rock with the shovel tip, listened for any whisper of gas and heard none, and wrapped the rock in a scrap of cloth so her glove would not steal the warmth from her palm as quickly. She brought the rock inside and tested the flatness against the plate. The stone sat true without wobble. Good. She dug a shallow cup in the floor just deep enough to nest the stone, tamping the rim so the lip would hold a seal. Then she cut another block from the clear pane and carved a bell large enough to cover the stone with a thumb's margin. She hollowed the underside with the curved blade, smoothing the inner surface with brined snow until it shone as well. The bell edge received a delicate bevel, so slush would lock it to the lip like a gasket when she set it down. She left two opposite points, slightly flattened to align with the intake and chimney when those cuts came. Airflow is a language. Intake must speak to the place where heat is born, and chimney must speak to the place where heat wants to leave. She traced a pencil-thin intake trench from the shadowed base of the wall to the cup, keeping the run low and straight so cold air could crawl where it preferred. She pressed a finger over the inner end and felt the outside world suck politely at her knuckle. The dome's crown vent answered with a whisper that said the draw was real. Then she carved the chimney, a vertical shaft from the top of where the bell would sit up into the dome's inner skin, stopping shy of the vent so the system did not become a careless torch. At the top of that shaft, she made the filter. Snow alone would work, but snow plus memory would work better. She packed the shaft with layered media, a lace of gauze to catch soot, a puck of sintered snow made by packing, wetting, and letting it glaze into a porous plug, another lace of gauze, and a final skim of fine crystals to calm flow. She perforated the plug with a med pin to open capillaries and then breathed across the crown vent to hear the filter talk back with a smooth hiss instead of a ragged one. The hiss pleased her. Sound tells truth when eyes still lie. Hesh cupped the foil dish in his hands and pressed a shallow curve into the center so the dish would return radiant heat toward the tinder instead of sending it sideways into the bell. He watched her line the intake with a smear of slush to harden the throat and nodded once at the craft of it, because a Draley understands how water changes allegiance when shape demands it. She checked the seal seat by setting the bell over the stone without tinder, then pulling a gloved palm away from the intake and watching the bell fog inside from her breath, a breath that then curled up the chimney and out through the sintered cap in a slender ghost. No leak flared from the edges. She lifted the bell and saw her breath had left a delicate rime on the inner curve. She smiled at that honest paint. The geometry for proof was ready. The drone arrived on its clock, as indifferent as nightfall. She announced the pre-ignition demonstration and walked the camera along each feature. The intake channel with its low run, the cup with its stone, the bell with its beveled edge, the chimney with its layered filter. She put a glove over the crown vent and drew a breath into the intake to show slack, then released the glove and repeated the move to show pull when the vent stood open. She laid a paper strip at the chimney mouth and showed the paper settle and lift with the steady pulse of air, as if the dome had learned to breathe without panting. The examiner asked her to disassemble the filter and reveal each layer. She did so, naming each purpose in a voice that did not ask for approval. The examiner acknowledged and ordered a reassembly before the star slid past the useful angle. She reassembled without hurry. Hesh set the lint under the foil dish and tucked the dish against the inner side of the bell so the lens would see a brighter target. He handled the tinder with a priest's care, not out of superstition, out of respect for the fact that mistakes at this scale are quiet until they are not. She trimmed a scrap of plant fiber from the ration and teased it through the lint as a dry spine, then stopped her hands and made herself look once more at the methane flat slit, then at the ridge, then at the pencil of the chimney. Any fast glance is an invitation to regret. Any last steady look is insurance. Satisfied, she set the bell over the stone with a slow quarter turn to seat the bevel into the slushed lip. The seal took, thin and clean. She packed the outer seam with a finger of wet snow and smoothed it until the joint gleamed. She could have called it done and reached for the lens, but she gave the chamber one more test. She slid a dry glove under the bell to feel the pressure change when she covered the intake. The bell clung with the faintest kiss of vacuum. When she lifted her glove, the kiss relaxed. That was the only romance she trusted on Calyx. Hesh's hands had stopped trembling long enough to hold the lens without risking a drop, so she let him nestle the oval on the plate while she positioned the foil dish with tweezers for the best line of sight. He followed her tiniest nods, rotating the lens until the oval's long axis ran with the fall of light. He gave the lens back, leaned his head against the wall for a heartbeat, and looked up with an expression that had lost some gray. The star slid into place. The bright patch on the polished wall gathered weight again, then condensed into the bead she had been training. She lifted the lens and found the bead's heart, moving her wrist on the memory of those earlier counts, letting muscle remember what mind had measured. She did not yet chase ignition, but the chamber had a pulse. She traced the beam across the bell to see where it struck and corrected by millimeters until the beam knifed through the ice and landed on the dish with a small white tightness. The foil brightened and returned the favor inward, so the light pooled exactly where the tinder waited. She drew the beam away and watched the brightness dim to ordinary. She looked at Hesh and read his face the way a navigator reads a shoreline. He was present, he was listening. He understood that the next step would not only make heat, it would announce something about the kind of mind she carried into a rule. He passed her the med pin without a word so she could prick one more capillary into the sintered plug and give the exhaust a cleaner path. He understood that heat and grace must share a room if a council is going to believe a report. She pushed the pin through, watched the snow glisten and stiffen, and reseated the filter. The drone hovered at the entrance slit and recorded. The dome smelled of cold and wool and that strange metallic note that snow gives when snow is about to change state. She adjusted the crown vent one last time to favor draw without starving the interior, and then rested the lens edge on the plate to spare her muscles for the long hold that would follow. The chamber was ready, the vent was tuned, the filter was clean, the intake whispered like a patient river. The foil waited with a calm shine, and the bead had learned its path like a migrating bird that had finally found the cut in a mountain range. Hesh closed his eyes and opened them with something like a prayer that did not need a god. She did not answer with words. She answered by lifting the lens and letting the star fall through ice. She pinched the lens between finger and thumb until the oval trembled into stillness, and the light inside the bell became a tight white seed. The beam swelled the seed to a glow, then to a smolder that moved like a thought through the gauze cloud. She felt the old ache gather in her forearm and ignored it, letting the tremor travel into breath instead of into the glass. The foil dish brightened to a dull mirror and sent the heat back into the tinder. A thread of smoke spun up, thin and blue, and curled to the chimney with a patience that told her the draw was true. The lint darkened, crinkled, and finally offered a small red eye. She held the focus steady and watched that eye open. The first flame was no more than a whispering petal, a flicker that did not dare touch the bell, content to paint the foil with wavering light while the stone drank heat and steadied the chamber's mood. The dome's air changed by degrees that a person would miss unless a life depended on noticing. Hesh noticed. His shoulders dropped a fraction, and his breath lost the glassy edge that made each inhale sound like an argument. He did not reach for the bell. He watched the chimney mouth instead, eyes on the filter, counting the beats of the faintest pulse of vapor that rose through the sintered plug and disappeared toward the crown vent. The drone at the entrance slit dropped half a meter and flashed a banner on its rim. Warning glyphs washed the dome in soft red and then withdrew as Examiner Luma's voice arrived, cool, exact, and close. Squad 4, you will halt if this is an open flame in open air. Mara did not flinch or shift the lens. She answered in the cadence of a checklist, every word a rung in a ladder she had already climbed. Contained flame within sealed chamber. Intake is finger width. Chimney is filtered, layered with gauze and sintered snow. Exhaust monitored at crown vent. No manufactured ignition. Passive optical focus only. Carved ice lens. No powered heaters. No reactive chemicals intended for thermal release. She spoke the rule back to the rule, and the drone hummed while its sensors read particulates at the vent mouth and searched the dome for hot plumes. The hum settled. Continue, but demonstrate negative pressure at the bell edge, the examiner said. Mara nodded and let the beam relax a hair, then slipped her free glove to the intake and covered it for an instant. The bell tugged at the seam with that faint kiss she trusted. When she lifted her glove, the tug eased. Containment verified, the examiner said. Medical justification acknowledged. Maintain chimney flow. If soot rises past threshold, you will extinguish. She thanked the voice without warmth or apology and returned her attention to the small fire that had finally learned to be a guest. It did not roar or reach. It breathed. The foil warmed to a steady shine, and the stone under the bell grew from indifferent cold to a patient heat that would outlast a brief stumble. She eased the intake trench with a finger-widening scrape and heard the chimney speak in a smoother hiss. The flame brightened, still low, still respectful. The dome's air softened in a way that could be measured by the absence of the knife inside the nose. She tasted water in that absence. Steam laced the exhaust and kissed the sintered plug, and the plug gave some of that kiss back to the dome as a mild damp that would not frost for a few minutes. Hesh felt the difference first in his gills. He lifted his face toward the crown vent and drew a long, careful breath as the warmer, wetter air threaded the delicate tissue that had been punished by cold. He made the Draley hum that means relief without weakness, then caught himself and returned to silence. She liked him for that. Relief should not chatter when a flame is this young. She held the lens steady and took inventory with everything that was not a hand. The bell's inner surface gathered a pearl-gray condensation that began to bead and run down to the bevel where she had sealed the seam. Every third drop escaped the joint and traced a tiny river along the slushed lip. She slid a fold of gauze to the seam with the back of a nail and let the cloth drink. When the gauze drooped with the first couple of warm tears, she twisted it into a thimble of melt over the plate and caught the drops in a shallow cup pressed from foil. The water was not hot. It was honest. She passed the cup to Hesh and told him to sip against his tongue and hold the sip behind his teeth before swallowing. He did as instructed. Color did not rush back to his face. The tremor did not vanish like a cheap trick. Instead, the stubborn hurt behind his eyes stepped back a pace, and his fingers learned his own pulse again. Outside, the wind changed key. The dome translated the shift into a lower, steadier pressure that tried to pull the vent's promise away from the chamber. She leaned her shoulder into the wall to feel the strain and used that invisible weight to tune the system. A tiny scrape at the chimney mouth with the med pin opened one more capillary in the plug. A narrow shave at the intake cleanly reset the balance. The flame answered with the smallest blue tooth at its base, a sign that oxygen arrived in the right proportion. She eased the beam off for 2 heartbeats to let the ember carry itself, then returned the focus and watched the small tongue recommit to the tinder. She would not chase brightness for pride. She wanted endurance. The stone took more heat and returned more patience. The chamber breathed. The second drone arrived like a dark snowflake. This one belonged to Commander Sirek. It carried no speaker, only a single lens and a circle of filters that rotated in silent judgments. It hovered at the slit, filmed the seam at the bell, filmed the intake, filmed the cap of sintered snow, then tilted to read the plume at the vent. Mara did not address it. She had nothing to ask and nothing to add beyond the work. The drone rose and left a subtle hush in its wake that did more to steady her than praise would have done. The first trial of any flame in a rule-bound room is pride, and the second is drift. Drift arrived in the form of a soft popcorn crackle as a buried air pocket in the stone spit a damp fleck that landed on the ember and tried to shame it into quitting. The ember winked, shrank, and pretended to be dead. Mara did not lift the bell. She did not breathe too quickly. She moved the lens half a degree and drew the focus away from the exact center, letting the light kiss the edge of the ember the way a person warms a stiff hand from the wrist inward rather than thrusting fingers into heat. The ember answered by returning a round, small glow and then laid down another layer of black ash that would hold this shape better. She smiled with only one corner of her mouth. Stubborn meets stubborn, and this time the better cause carried the better patience. A siren burred once in the far distance and cut off. Another squad had tried an inflatable and lost a seam, or someone had gotten clever with a chemical hand warmer and learned why the clause named intent as well as heat. Hesh flinched when the sound arrived, then blinked hard as if he had just caught his own panic by the collar. She tilted her head a fraction toward the crown vent and kept the lens on task. When his breathing tripped, she said his name once and told him to count the pulses at the chimney. He listened, counted, and steadied, as if the dome had loaned him its rhythm. The examiner's voice returned with a strange softness that carried no indulgence. "Squad 4, report exhaust qualities." Mara answered without looking away from the light. "No visible soot escaping the filter. Moisture condensing under crown. Odor clean, slight sweet note from scorched plant fiber. Heat rise inside dome minimal and steady. Acknowledged," the voice said. "You will produce a second proof. Open the crown vent 2 fingers. Show the chamber denies backdraft." Mara set her teeth and did as asked. She opened the vent, felt the dome's breath strengthen, and watched the flame bow inward for a heartbeat, testing for a path the wrong way. The plug caught that impulse and calmed it. The blue tooth at the base remained blue. The ember did not blow out or wander. She gave the drone the picture it had demanded. The drone clicked once and went quiet. She thinned a shaving of ice from the inner wall and slid it under the bell with a wire hook she had shaped from the medkit clasp before the lens work began. She had placed the hook on the plate at the start of the attempt because a mind that expects success does better work than a mind that bargains with luck. The shaving lay on the stone where radiant warmth could coax it into a pool that would creep to the bevel and feed the slow drip into the gauze. She warmed another thimble and passed it to Hesh. He sipped, held, and swallowed, and a different sound came from him. Something like a small wave that finds a beach it recognizes. He leaned his temple against the dome for a moment, then straightened because he knew posture can become permission to quit if a person gives it too much room. The flame stabilized. It learned how to be small without being weak. The bell's inner shell shed tears in a loop that fed the seam and then the cup. The foil dish blackened in a clean, even pattern that told her the beam sat true. She did not force the process faster. She let the stone deepen its heat reservoir until it could outlast a brief cloud or a hand cramp. When the ache in her forearm sharpened, she braced the lens edge on a flat of her glove and took the weight with a different set of muscles. She counted slow to keep the motion honest. Hesh picked up the count at the exact moment she needed it. Not a breath sooner, not a breath late. It was a small kindness and a large proof that his mind had returned to himself. Outside, a Vorthak instructor crossed the basin with the posture of judgment. His cloak shed ice with every step and left a wake of glitter that fell back to the surface in slow arcs. He paused near the methane flats and watched the silk of vapor run across the plain. He glanced at the academy mast, then at the ridge, then at the sky star. His head tilted a degree when the star nicked a thinner part of cloud and gave the dome another handful of light. In that gift, the flame inside the bell grew to the size of a child's thumbnail and stayed there, a tethered sun lighting a world of rules without burning it. The examiner spoke again, this time addressing the class frequency. "Observe Squad 4's containment. Note intake geometry and filtered chimney. Note that medical stabilization is prioritized over comfort. Note that the letter of the rule is not a toy, but neither is it a blindfold. Record this method as calyx sealed chamber, ice lens ignition, passive. If you cannot reproduce the containment, do not attempt the ignition. The channel filled with a rush of breath from places that had been too proud to ask for help. Mara listened to none of it. She watched the bell. She watched the seam. She watched the slow darkening of the filter's lower gauze, then pinched a corner and wiggled it free an inch so fresh fiber could take the load without asking the plume to find another path. The adjustment worked. The chimney kept its patient hiss. She leaned closer and let the warmth that leaked through the bell's ice kiss her cheek. The kiss was small and brave. She put her palm to the dome skin above Hesh's shoulder and felt the difference 15 minutes of lawful heat and lawful steam had made. The air was no longer a blade. It was a stern teacher. Hesh cupped his hands around the cup and sipped again. The tremor in his wrists retreated another step. His voice, when it returned, had the sanded grain of someone who has repaired a crack instead of hiding it. He asked if she wanted him to take the lens. She smiled and told him she wanted him to take the count. He did, and she let the numbers carry her hand across the next long minute. The first real challenge had arrived with the warning glyphs. The second arrived in quiet, the way problems often do when a person thinks an argument has been won. A dusting of frost began to form around the intake where her glove had shrouded it during the demonstration. The frosting threatened to narrow the throat and starve the flame without drama. She saw it before it became a fact and pinched the crust away with a knuckles' careful scrape. A faint thread of brighter blue touched the flame's root in gratitude. She let that gratitude wash through her and then set it down. Gratitude is a good servant and a poor master. Time stretched into a line she could walk. The chamber breathed. The dome breathed. Hesh breathed. The crown vent earned its keep, carrying away the trace that could have turned the air harsh. The examiner's drone kept its vigil and found nothing it could justly object to. Warm water and mild steam did what power could not. They steadied a living system without scaring it. When the star slipped behind a heavier braid of cloud, she eased the lens away and let the ember hold. It did. The stone returned the favor she had asked of it and carried the chamber through the dim minute until light returned. That was the moment she allowed herself the smallest exhale of pride, because endurance had been handed back to her by a thing she had built and tuned and defended with words that did not lie. She did not lower her guard. She shifted the lens, found the bead again, and fed the ember until it opened its small, bright mouth and spoke the only sentence she needed to hear. We will keep him warm, and we will do it without breaking faith. Dawn arrived on Calyx without drama, only a slow bleaching of the thin sky and a hush in the wind that felt like a teacher closing a book. The chamber under the bell was still alive, a small, disciplined heart that had carried the worst hours without once asking for permission to misbehave. She made the choice to end it with the same care that had begun it. She eased the lens away, let the ember speak for itself, and then choked the intake with a careful plug of snow while opening the crown vent to full draw so the chimney would pull the last breath in the right direction. The flame thinned, curled inward as if bowing to the room that had hosted it, and collapsed into a red point that went black without smoke. She lifted the bell a finger width to check for stray glow, found only the honest damp of a clean finish, and seated the ice again to let the stone surrender its reservoir into steam that would soften the dome for a few minutes more. Hesh's hands had steadied by then. He no longer guarded each movement as if every gesture might spill something he could not afford to lose. He helped her break down the filter in the order the examiner had watched her build it, laying each layer on the plate like a diagram that had chosen to be proof instead of decoration. The gauze strips showed a neat gray that spoke of trapped soot without drama. The sintered plug smelled only of clean water and a faint sweetness that had once been plant fiber. She held those truths to the drone's lens and let the camera make its own argument. The trial clock chimed across the band with the indifferent mercy of an exam that cannot be bargained with. 24 hours logged. Squads would return on a stagger to prevent a parade of accidents at the ridge. She marked their exit window, packed the bell in a sleeve of snow so the cold would not shatter it when the dome pressure changed, wrapped the lens in her cap, and took the stone in cloth so the last of its heat would not write a new, dangerous story into the floor. Before she cut the door wider, she leaned her forehead to the curve above Hesh's shoulder and listened. The dome had a sound when a job was done cleanly. It is not a word. It is a release. She heard it and let herself believe it. The walk back was a lesson in restraint. The methane silk still wrote low cursive across the flats, and the ridge made no apology for the way it gathered wind. She kept Hesh on the line of safest pressure and set a pace that would not invite sweat. The drones shadowed them without harassment. A cadet to the south dragged a torn shelter by one corner, while an instructor paced beside him like a metronome that meant forgiveness without erasing the grade. On the ridge, Commander Sirek waited with the posture of stone set where a wall needs to be honest. He did not wave them in. He marked them in. At the egress lock, the audit repeated in reverse. The drone read her packs and found no illegal heat signatures. The med officer brushed a thermal wand across Hesh's gill line and nodded when the color chart settled where a body belongs. The officer's eyes slid to the cloth-wrapped lens in Mara's hand and then to the bell sleeve that had hoar-frosted during the walk. Curiosity moved across his mouth and stopped at discipline. He recorded serials and seals and sent them inward with a stamp that sounded louder to someone who had not slept. The debrief chamber was warm enough to make the first breath feel heavy. Windows of crystalline ice hung above the table like captured sky, and behind them a film of the basin replayed at quarter speed so counselors could attach cause to effect without pretending hindsight is magic. Examiner Luma sat at the center with a slate of data, Commander Sirek at her right with hands folded like an argument waiting for a better one. The room was full without being crowded. Mara stood where a well-evaluated cadet stands, feet set to take questions as facts rather than lashes. Hesh took the seat to her left and adjusted his scarf with dignity instead of embarrassment. The first portion was not words. The council watched the cut of light inside the dome, the building of the lens, the proof of pressure, the first flame, the water that kissed the gauze, the steady plume at the vent. The audio logged each check. No open flame in open air, no powered heaters, no manufactured ignition. Containment geometry demonstrated, soot below threshold, medical justification recorded. The council did not play the sirens from other squads. Those would be addressed in rooms where comfort would serve as a witness rather than a judge. When the lights came up, Luma asked the only question that mattered if intent meant to stay honest. How had she read the line between letter and spirit before risking combustion on a volatile world? Mara answered in the same cadence she had used at the slit. The spirit of the rule was protection of life and environment. The letter enumerated means and contexts that history had proved dangerous, carried fuels, powered heaters, manufactured ignition, open flame in open air. The chamber replaced those with geometry, passive optics, and filtration under supervision. She said the sentence that she had rehearsed in her own mind while the flame learned to be a guest. If a council writes a wall, a cadet must not treat it as a dare, but also must not pretend the wall surrounds all ground if the council has left a gate for lawful rescue. Luma listened without interruption. Commander Sirek entered the conversation with the smallest tilt of his head. He asked about failure modes that had not occurred and wanted answers that did not rely on good fortune. What would she have done if the flame had sought a seam? She described the snow slurry she had on hand to quench and seal without shock. What if the chimney had begun to backdraft during a pressure drop? She walked the room through the vent discipline and the fast pinch at the intake that turns the bell into a vacuum that inhales harm instead of exhaling panic. What if the lens had shattered into sugar that could not be pulled from the tinder without lifting the bell? She showed the wire hook she had shaped from a clasp and explained the ugly option of starving the chamber with snow even if it entombed the hook. Sirek's face did not warm. His questions sharpened until the answers no longer required the kind of luck that examiners call courage when a person survives and folly when a person does not. Then he stopped. Hesh spoke once, a short statement that did not trade on drama. He described the moment the air stopped feeling like a blade and started feeling like a stern teacher. He spoke about consent, about how she had explained the design in whole and had offered to accept a shutdown with extraction rather than argue with a rule. His voice had the grain of someone who has been cold enough to lie and had decided not to. The room held that sentence carefully. The council recessed for 20 minutes that felt like a winter of too many seconds. The crystalline windows showed the film of the ridge again, now with a slow overlay of pressure, isobars mapped to the exact minutes when tent seams failed or discipline held. Mara let her shoulders settle and reminded her jaw that clenching is a choice. Hesh sipped warm saline and stared at his hands, as if he had been rented a version of them he preferred. When the council returned, the verdict did not try to hide behind polite phrases. The act had been legal under the directive as written, ethical under the Academy's charter, and exemplary in design, proof, and restraint. The council called the method a doctrine so cadets would not mistake it for a trick. The doctrine received a name that made no myth of it: calyx-sealed combustion, passive optic ignition, Medical Protocol 1. It would live as an addendum with exact diagrams, vent ratios, filter media, and shutdown procedures. It would require pre-ignition demonstration to a drone before any spark of heat was allowed under ice. It would forbid pride in the presence of flame by mandating that a second cadet count the chimney's pulse aloud in rooms where 2 bodies could stand. It would warn instructors to treat it as a last resort for stabilization, not a camp comfort. It would live alongside the original line in heavy text: "No open flame in open air." The council did not amend that line. The council clarified what open means, what air means, what containment means, and what supervision must look like when a human mind reaches for geometry to keep a partner alive. Commander Sirek added an instructor note that would travel farther than any medal. He wrote that rule literacy is not loophole hunting and that a species earns trust by showing that it can keep a promise when no one is watching except a very cold world. The Academy recorded the note under his signature without commentary. Recognition came in the quiet form that matters: a mark on a record that is hard to earn and harder to fake, a stipend of time in the engineering bay to teach the doctrine to first years, and a short message routed to her personal file from Luma, written with the exact grammar of someone who does not gossip with praise. The message thanked her for choosing containment over cleverness and for reading the ground with the same intensity she used to read the line. Hesh received a separate commendation for composure under hypothermic stress and for the clarity of a witness who understands that consent is part of survival rather than ornament on a report. The days that followed were work instead of legend. She stood under a training dome with a bright lamp and a box of scrap ice, teaching knots of cadets with different lungs and different bones how to make a lens that would not shatter, how to hear the difference between a chimney that breathes and a chimney that lies, how to seat a bell so the seam shrug feels like the right kind of kiss. She made students switch roles so the one who held the lens learned the ache that teaches humility, and the one who counted at the vent learned the patience that saves hands. She failed them on minor points and passed them only when the doctrine felt boring, because boring is what safety looks like once a human mind has done the interesting parts correctly. News travels faster than wind in places where pride looks for new mirrors. Reports reach the outposts, where glacial air forgets compassion, and an amphibious miner on a distant moon sent a note through the Academy's public channel that a sealed T-light had stabilized a partner long enough for real help to arrive. The miner did not mention species. The miner mentioned gratitude. The Academy archived the note under the doctrine without a victory flourish. On the day the addendum moved from provisional to permanent, she returned to the ridge with Hesh and stood where the silk of methane had written its cursive in the cold. The flats lay quiet under a clean sky. The place looked smaller because she understood it better. That is a trick the mind plays to thank a person for doing the hard reading. Hesh stood with his hands bare for a moment and flexed fingers that belonged to him again. He told her he would sign up to assist in the first-year labs so he could teach the count at the vent to cadets who might one day trust that sound more than a heartbeat. He said the dome's hush had become his favorite music. She did not mock him for that. She understood. She had her own song now, the small, precise hiss of lawful heat moving through a filter under ice. The story did not end in a parade or a slogan. It ended in a manual that was heavier by a few pages and lighter by one kind of accident, in a room where a Draley cadet could drink warm water without flinching, in an academy that had learned a new sentence to sit beside the old one. Humans read rules. Humans respect risks. Humans will still find a way to keep a partner breathing when the cold pretends to be the law. She did not carry the lens as a trophy. She left it in the lab where a first year could fog it with a breath and see imperfections she had missed. She kept only the habit that mattered, the one that had saved a life without rewriting a line. She read the next directive the council issued with the same attention she had given the one on Calyx, and felt the quiet satisfaction of a craft that no longer needs permission to be careful. When she slept that night, she dreamed not of flame, but of the small, disciplined plume at the crown vent, a patient ghost that proved a person can share heat with the world without stealing safety from it.